Hi, Kat here for Lightwave Digital. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to create a very simple but pretty looking Northern Lights or Aurora Borealis effect that you might see in the wintertime. And it's really just a very simple process to create something like this, so let's get started. Let's clear this scene out and go to Lightwave Modeler and start by creating a box, which will be our Northern Lights strip. And I've already got my numeric tool here. If you need to close it or activate it, just hit the N key. And we want a box that doesn't have any depth to it, so we're going to turn the depth down to 0. And we're going to punch in some other numbers here. We want it to be about 25 meters wide and about 15 meters tall. All right, let's hit A to get out of the zoomed in so it fits everything into your viewport. And we want some segments on this, so let's go X segments 25 and Y segments 15. So basically we've got squares that are 1 meter apiece. And we can hit enter. And you'll notice that we are looking through our perspective view on the z-axis plus, or plus z-axis, or positive z-axis. That's where the polygons are facing. Now, when I work with people that are brand new to Lightwave or coming from other pieces of software, I always tell them build your models as they would load so that if you put them in front of a camera, their back would be towards you and they would be facing the same direction you would be. It's very important for building vehicles, characters, cars, planes, whatever. It doesn't matter because Z is generally the path of animation for movement going in a forward direction on the positive axis, and you want things that are built in this manner to be, your right arm is on the right side when you load it into Lightwave layout, and your left arm is on the left side, so you load it into Lightwave layout. That's where it is when it's facing away from you, and it loads automatically in camera. But in this particular case, we want to load this so it's already facing towards camera. So after I've created this box or this grid, I'm going to hit F to flip those polygons towards negative Z. As you can see, the little Z indicators there. That one's negative Z, and the other one on the other side is positive Z. And the reason for that is when it loads, it's already facing towards us, and I don't have to turn it around 360 degrees. Because this doesn't have any arms, it doesn't have any wings, it doesn't have any right, left tires. We want it to load automatically like this. Now, secret to making these types of effects with the texturing method that we're going to use is that we're going to use the pivot point, which is the origin in Modeler, or designated by us manually, as an input to drive gradients for transparency and luminosity. So we need to either move this pivot tool ourselves, or we can undo that, drop the tool and hit T and just move it up slightly above the x-axis. And the reason for this is because if you're right directly on top of that x-axis going across, you might have problems with your gradient. So we need a little bit of wiggle room just so we don't have a problem with a gradient. So that's why I'm not using the shortcut F3 for rest to ground. I'm just going to move it manually by hitting the control key and moving with my mouse to keep it on a constrained axis. And that should be good. And we can always go back into model after we go into layout if it becomes a problem. But this is what we need. And we're going to hit Q to assign a surface to this. Okay, by normal it's default. We definitely want to name this something like Northern Lights. Okay. We don't need any specularity, and we do need some smoothing because we are going to displace this. So we're going to hit 89.5, which is the normal default for the smoothing angles. Okay, and we want to make this a subpatched object. So we're going to enable it as subpatch. We're going to hit tab, and you'll notice that the corners now become rounded off. This is important because when we displace this with a texture, it needs to displace with the polygons flipping around in the wrong direction, and it'll look all smooth. All right, so now that we've got that, let's go and save this object. Save object as, and we'll call this Northern Lights Strip 3. Okay, and we can send it back over to layout. Send object to layout. And we can see now that it's facing towards us. It's ready to go because it's an effect plane, so to speak. And we want it to point towards us because that's basically the orientation that's necessary so we can see it without having to rotate it around or use double-sided surfaces. Although we can go into the surface editor. Pardon me, I pulled up the graph editor there by accident. And we can enable double-sided surfaces, which was what we have to do anyways, but I like to keep things clean instead of having to rotate the object around 360 degrees or 180 degrees, or whatever it may be, to get to face the camera and not have to worry about that problem. Now, because this is an effect that is self-illuminating, as we know that northern lights or aurora borealis is an effect that's produced by highly charged particles in the atmosphere interacting with the magnetic field of the Earth and solar radiation. So it's going to have its own illumination. So we don't have to worry about lighting this. So let's go to the scene editor and turn off these two lights that are the default ones that come in when you start a new scene because we don't need them. Now we're going to use a different material type. Instead of the principal BSDF shader or any of these other shaders, we're going to use standard, which is an emulation of the original Lightwave shading system. I find that this is just easier to do for this type of effect using this, and it doesn't cause any conflicts with other materials. Okay, we're going to make sure that that's all set to basically 0 when we can start working this out. First thing we need to do here is turn up our luminosity so we can see it. Okay, and we're going to go and enable VPR, and we should just be presented with basically a gray plane. Let's change a base color here to something a little bit more pretty, like that purple we had before. All right, and now we can start with the transparency. We're going to use the transparency texture editor, and we're going to select a grid for a layer type. And instead of previous layer as an input parameter, we're going to use Y distance to pivot. Okay. And now we can start changing the values in here with a gradient. So you can see that at that 1 meter spot, like we may need to increase our end point a little bit. But what we're after here is a gradient that cuts off the bottom effectively in kind of a soft manner. Let's change these key points to linear, and we'll spread this out a little bit so that we can see things a little bit better. Let's go to 2 meters for endpoint. Okay. So this is obviously not the right direction for us, so we can use the invert key, and now we've got basically that hard kind of edge at the bottom, but we can fix that. Let's take this and just punch another key in there, and then we'll go value 100, and we can get it to soften up. Okay. Let's take care of that portion first, though. Okay. There we go. Let's go 100 here. Boom, boom. And set this one to 0. Okay, and another one at 100. Now you can see what the effect is there. So bounce one in here at 100%, and the first one will be at 0. I think that should give us a nice controlled edge. Okay, maybe a little bit more at 0, 100. Zoom in here and make sure that we've got something that looks pretty good. Okay, so it's just feathered just slightly. That's fine. And, again, we can go back into Modeler and move this a little bit if necessary. But now we can start worrying about the parameter for getting this to extend a little bit more. So let's take this out and drag this a little bit higher. There we go. Just so we've got that little concentrated edge. Okay. And we'll go to like, this was 15 meters tall, so let's go 15. And now we've got a gradient that feathers it off very high in the distance. We don't want it that much, so let's choke it down a little bit. Okay, that's pretty reasonable. And we're going to need another one as a gradient, and this one is going to work differently, but it's still going to use a input distance to pivot. But let's go and add a layer. Let's go gradient, and it'll cancel that previous layer out because of the blending mode. So let's change this to additive, and we're going to change the previous layer input parameter to X distance to pivot, and we're going to punch in a key kind of in the middle there. We're going to change its value to 0, and we can see that now we've got the x-axis working for us. Now we need to invert this as well, so it's kind of doing the opposite effect, and we need to spread this out quite a bit. So this was, I believe, 25 meters, and then we can spread this out. So there we go. Something similar to that. Keep going, keep going, keep going. Okay. It's not too bad. Give it a little bit of a circular shape. Okay. It's pretty close to what I want. Now that we've got that, we can check the alpha of this in VPR so that it should match what we kind of got in the gradient for our output when it's in color, because we want that similar shape. All right, now we definitely want to use these gradients again. We definitely want the one that's specifically controlling the fall off from the pivot point going upwards. So we're going to copy this and we're going to put it into the luminosity channel. So let's hit the luminosity channel editor and pump it in there, and we can see that we've got a little bit of a problem at the bottom there. So let's fix this. You can see that we're right in there. So let's kind of pull that back to where it was, and we'll go zoom in here, say like 1 meter, so we can see these keys a little bit better. Okay, we'll get rid of these ones, that one there. And that gives us the removal of that hard edge, but we want to brighten it up at the bottom, because this 0 here is actually the pivot point going up. It's kind of a little bit confusing, but once you understand how it's oriented, it's not so bad. So let's turn this up significantly. Okay. Let's turn this up. And yes, you can pump values well beyond 100%, but for something like this, we want to keep it kind of under control. All right, so now that we've got something like that, let's back out, say like 5 meters, so we can see those gradients a little bit better. Okay, and I think what we're going to do is we're going to go in additive mode. Okay, so it's that luminosity value plus the additive amount of 100% of the layer opacity. If you want to see the effect of that, you can turn it up or down, layer opacity. So basically we're doing a mathematical operation here. It's 100% luminosity, and we're going to add this gradient amount to drive it. Okay? So if we wanted to go to that first key and crank it up, we most certainly could, but we don't want it to be overbearing. We just want it to sit there at 0. Because we're going to add some additional textures to this that will help bring this to life. So next thing we want to do here is probably add a procedural layer. Oh, let's remove that. Add procedural layer. Something like turbulence. Great option for this, although there are other procedural types you can try to work with. Fractal noise being another option very classic Lightwave texture in the procedural category. Works very much in the same way as turbulence, but with different mathematics behind it to make it look a little bit more chunky. So we'll just use turbulence for now. We're going to work with a value of 100%, and we're going to leave the frequencies the way they are, but we're going to pump this up to 20% contrast. Now here comes the fun part. We're going to go and hit additive. Okay, so we're adding this luminosity value. This gradient is being added to that, and we're going to add again the turbulence texture. These white values in here are going to add on top, and the black values are not going to contribute anything other than anything above zero in a 0 to 100% luminous scale. All right, now we want to change the texture so it's kind of streaky. So let's go down to the scale tab down here, and we're going to spread this out on the x-axis a bit, and we're also going to increase the y-axis so it looks a little stretched out, and maybe we'll need it a little bit tighter like that. Okay, that's not too bad. All right, don't really need the z-axis because there's no depth to this object whatsoever. But now what we need to do is we need to have this kind of animate. So we're going to go over to position, and we're going to use the envelope button on X, and it'll bring up our graph editor. And we want to create a keyframe at 0. So we just hit enter and create it. And we're going to create a keyframe at 120 frame. And we'll say it's 3 meters that's going to travel from 0 to positive X axis. Right mouse select these and change their curve. So no matter where I have this in animation in terms of time, it could be minus 500 frames or plus 50,000 frames in our timeline. It'll automatically continue this animation indefinitely. If you zoom out, it'll just keep on going, keep on going, keep on going. So let's go zoom back in just so we can see what's going on. And we'll probably reuse this envelope in a second. So I'll copy it, put it into the copy buffer there. So now the effect of that is basically we've got a little bit of stretch like this, okay, and it's going to move in a certain direction. All right, let's add another procedural to this, and this one we're going to change, and we're going to have it be multiply, and we're going to modify this procedural type to something like Coryllis. I think this one will work very nicely for us. Make sure it's on the x-axis, and again, scale it out a little bit and stretch it upwards so it gives us like a nice effect of being part of that streakiness. We'll change the noise type to gradient value noise. It just gives me a little bit of a nicer look. Okay, so now that we've got something like that, we need to also change its position, again, the x-axis. And because the northern lights, generally they'll shift and they have patterns that shift slower or faster inside of themselves, let's paste that envelope back in here, but just go and change that end keyframe just a little bit slower so that when it plays back through this, we've got shifting patterns over top of shifting patterns. Similar to that. All right, well, that's cool for that, but we need a little bit more love here. We want some additional color in here. So we'll just take this entire stack, shift-clicking it from the luminosity editor, and we'll copy the current layers, and we'll go to the color, and we'll paste all of this in over top. So we're going to add 2 layers. We're going to get rid of that one input at the bottom, and we're going to change this gradient. I think I'm just going to turn it off for now so we can just deal with it separately. But when we pasted these in, they were just based on values from 0 to 1 or 0 to 100% in a single channel. There's no color to it, so we need to pick a color. So let's go and grab a nice blue or something like that. Okay. And this is additive to the base color. Maybe we want to use something different for a blending mode, like multiply. That's starting to get a little bit more northern lighty. Let's invert it so it pops out a little bit better. Okay, just give it a little bit of a color shift there. Let's take the Coriolis texture, give it a nice, say, green one for color. Okay, and for something like this, let's go additive, and we'll turn this right down because it's a little too funky. All right, and let's turn on that gradient again. And for this one, we need to just be multiply, and we'll get rid of this independent keyframe that was just floating in there. Maybe we'll make sure that this is extended to 15 so I can see whether or not there's an additional keyframe at the end. Okay, so we can just change that. So we'll go from kind of a nice base color, which is that purplish again, maybe with a little brighter hue. Okay, and at the end of the gradient, we kind of want something that's going to be darker or maybe a different color altogether. Okay, and we can turn this particular alpha value down so it's not so prominent. So it's a gradient that basically fades from one color to another, but it is layered in such a way that this color is only multiplying the base color at a certain percentage value. We invert those keys if we want, make them look that way. We mix these things all up in a different manner, restacking them. It's up to you. All right, now that's kind of okay, but I think we need to give ourselves a little bit of that love with those textures in there for the transparency, because we don't want this arc in here. We want streaks. So I still have them in the copy buffer, so I can go and add 2 layers. I can get rid of that extra gradient that we popped in there, so we can turn that one off. All right, very interesting look. And I think we'll just remove that layer right now. And we can just back off the values of each one of these and see what we get. That's kind of nice. It looks like kind of fiery. Maybe we'll invert them. That's kind of pretty. Go multiply. That kind of cuts off the end of it. So we'll have to go with additive, I think. Well, that's not too bad. Now, this was kind of a squarish shape. If we go back to texture, we can see it's kind of a square shape. We need something that's a little bit more of a band. Because we've textured these with procedurals, we can stretch this out using the H key, and I can create a texture that'll shift like that. And with a little bit of love in our texture editors again, we can start to stretch things out in a good direction. But what's really going to sell this is the displacement on the object. So let's take a look at how to do that right now. Let's hit the P for Properties tab for the object, and we have subdivision on here. We need subdivision on the object because it is a sub-patched object that we enabled in Lightwave Modeler. And we need a displacement map. So we're going to use a displacement map. We're going to double click that. We're going to be presented with a very similar texture editor that we've been using to texture the object. Now all we need to do is get something on here that is a procedural that'll do something similar, but in displacing it based off of a certain direction. And we want it to displace on the z-axis. And we want a positional change so that it follows our energy wave, so to speak. So let's hit enter in the graph editor on one of the channels, which would be the x-axis channel. And we'll go to frame 120, and we'll say it's moving at about 2 meters. We want to make sure that we've got our pre and post behavior change, so it's linear, for the same reasons that we did with the texture itself, so that no matter where we put it in the animation, we've got something that works for us. Okay, so now we've got that set up. We've got a little bit of displacement on this. It's not as prevalent as I would like it to be. So let's increase the texture value to 1. And we're going to increase the contrast to 20%, similar to what we had before. So when we look at this from up here, we need to be careful that we have enough subdivisions in the object so that it's smooth and we don't have polys flipping in all weird kinds of places. So let's make sure that that's set to something a little bit higher, like 5. And we might even want to change the location of the displacement map in the deformation stack to a different location. We can immediately see that this is now smoother because we're basically displacing it and then we're telling Lightwave to subdivide it after the fact, and it changes how that looks. So now we've got something that's a little bit better, and we can start cranking these values up significantly using texture value. Well, if we go too far, it'll start doing some very strange stuff. So we want to keep this kind of tame. So like maybe 2.5. No, not 25, 2.5. There we go. All right. So these procedurals are a little bit heavy, meaning they're a little bit tighter than I'd like, but that's okay. Again, we can stretch this object out. Get a nice effect there. And if we're not finding ourselves liking this as it is, we'll go back into the surface editor and start playing around with the transparency a little bit more. Keep in mind though, because we've changed the distance of object or distance of pivot based off of the size of the object, these are going to be a little bit different to handle. They're still based off of the original size, but you can start pulling that gradient down and you can start getting really nice bands. Try to keep it mild, keep it gentle. You can do stuff like this. You can get a really nice look. Let's go back to the surface editor and make another adjustment in the luminosity channel with that gradient. And you can start to create little bands in there. To simulate different waves coming in from the sun and that solar radiation. Very cool stuff. Of course, at any point in time, you want to mix things up a little bit with your effect. Look at trying to rotate one of the procedurals, either being turbulence or Coriolis, through the object. So you can see that when I change that value, we get a little bit of a sparkle going on. So let's try that with the envelope. Let's say frame 120. We'll call this, it's rotated maybe 45 degrees. And we'll just zoom out and make it consistent. So that, again, no matter where it is in animation, it'll automatically be loaded and drive like that. And it'll look really pretty. Very cool stuff. And of course, you can add a different method of controlling this. You could use a reference object, so you can move various textures around. You could add additional luminosity gradients, transparency gradients, and all kinds of different methods of getting it to appear. And of course, if you take this into a compositing program, add a little bit of glow, maybe gradient shift, you can get some really, really cool effects with it. So let's move our camera back a little bit, because we're in perspective view. Let's go to camera. And we'll just put the camera. You can see we've got a little bit of gradients up there as well. So we stretch this out quite a bit. So we'll point it up towards the sky. And we've got, a nice little Northern Light effect. And of course, multiple copies of this in the scene. Whoops, that's the camera. Let's not use the camera. Let's go and clone the actual object. Got to be careful with placements on this, though. We're stretching this. We don't want to stretch it. We want to move it in our scene. You get some really nice looking effects. Now, keep in mind that when you go to save this, the displacements for this are going to be based off of the scene. They're not going to be based on textures or something that would be saved into the object. So you have to save this scene. So let's make sure that we're going to get what we want here. Maybe we'll change up the displacement map a little bit for this one. Okay. So that when we save this and we reload it, let's call this 2. It'll come back in as it was. So there you go, a little neat Northern Lights effect. Granted, this is just a quick example, but with a little bit of extra massage work and some additional creativity, playing around with those gradients, using separate surfaces for different objects, of course, you can get some really, really cool stuff. And these can be used for other types of applications in visual effects, such as blast waves, horizon effects, doing like strange lettering effects, such as from the original Superman movie. You'd have this type of geometry stretching off the letters, and you could shade them with gradients in a procedural, kind of like a God light effect or God rays effect, but with a little bit more of a psychedelic parameter. And it is really quite interesting that the Northern Lights do present themselves the way they do. It's a phenomenal effect if you do get far north enough, and it is really, really quite the sight to see. But if you can't get that far north, then you can make your own here in Lightwave. All right, thank you for watching.